The briefing was supposed to end the argument. It didn't. When Democratic members of Congress walked out of that closed-door session with Pam Bondi, the looks on their faces told the story before a single word was spoken. Not shock, not surprise. Something heavier than both of those things. The particular expression of people who had gone into a room expecting incomplete answers and came out holding something worse. The confirmation that the incompleteness was deliberate. Because what Bondi presented inside that briefing room was not a classified explanation for why 3 million Epstein documents remain withheld from the public. It was not a detailed timeline for when those documents would be released. It was not an accounting of which categories of material were being held, and under what legal authority. It was not the kind of substantive disclosure that congressional oversight is designed to produce when lawmakers request a briefing on a matter of national significance. What it was, according to multiple members who attended, was a curated summary, carefully selected, strategically incomplete, delivered with the practiced confidence of an administration that has decided the appearance of cooperation is sufficient, and that the distinction between appearing transparent and being transparent does not need to be acknowledged out loud. The Democrats in that room noticed the distinction immediately. To understand why this briefing became its own confrontation, separate from the public hearings, separate from the document fights, separate from everything that had already played out on camera, you have to understand what a classified briefing is supposed to do, and what this one failed to deliver. When Congress requests a classified briefing on a sensitive investigation, the implicit agreement is straightforward. Lawmakers surrender the ability to discuss the specifics publicly in exchange for receiving the actual truth privately. The trade only works if both sides honor it. Lawmakers accept the confidentiality constraints. The executive branch provides genuine disclosure. The trade Bondi offered in that room was different. Or she accepted the confidentiality constraints on behalf of Congress, meaning the members who attended were legally restricted from discussing classified details publicly, while delivering a presentation that multiple attendees later described as containing nothing they hadn't already read in public reporting. The classification restrictions applied. The classified content did not materialize. That asymmetry is not a procedural technicality. It is a mechanism. It uses the architecture of oversight to neutralize oversight, binding lawmakers to silence while providing them with nothing that required silence in the first place. The moment members began walking out of the briefing room, the frustration was visible and immediate. Representative after representative stopped in the corridor outside. Some spoke directly to reporters who had been waiting. Others gathered in small clusters, voices low, expressions tight, comparing notes on what they had just experienced. The specific details of what was said inside the room remained protected. But the characterizations of what had not been said were not. One member described the briefing as a reading of a press release in a classified setting. Another said that every question about the 3 million unreleased documents had been met with language so vague it could have come from a public statement. A third used a single word: insulting. What they were describing was a pattern that anyone who has watched executive congressional relations over the past several decades will recognize immediately. When an administration wants to appear cooperative without actually being cooperative, a classified briefing is one of the most effective tools available. It creates the optics of engagement. It allows officials to say they have briefed Congress. It generates a paper trail showing that the oversight process was honored. And it does all of this while revealing exactly as much as the administration decided in advance to reveal, which in this case, according to those who attended, was very little. The specific questions that went unanswered inside that briefing room are now public because the members who attended were careful to describe the shape of the silence without crossing into classified territory. They had asked about the criteria being applied to the 3 million withheld documents. What legal standard determined which pages could be released and which could not? The answer they received referenced the same framework Bondi had used in public hearings: privacy protections, classification considerations, ongoing review processes. No specific criteria. No defined thresholds. No explanation of who was making individual decisions about individual documents. They had asked about the timeline for additional releases. When would the next batch be made public? What percentage of the remaining material was expected to clear review within the next 30, 60, 90 days? The answer they received was that the department was committed to a thorough and responsible process, and that releases would continue as material was cleared. No dates, no percentages, no commitments. They had asked about executive equities, the designation that Chip Roy had already exposed in open session. The internal classification that indicated someone above the department level had reviewed specific Epstein documents before determining whether they could be released. Who had conducted those reviews? Which documents had been flagged for executive-level consultation? What was the outcome of those consultations? The answer they received was that executive equities designations were standard procedure in sensitive investigations, and that the department could not discuss the specifics of internal review processes in the current setting. In a classified briefing about classified documents, they could not discuss the specifics. That answer, delivered behind closed doors, under classification restrictions that prevented the members from repeating it publicly, became the defining moment of the briefing. Because it meant that the most consequential question about the Epstein files, the question of whether political influence had shaped which documents were released and which were withheld, had been raised inside the one setting specifically designed to answer it. And it had been deflected with the same language used in public. The classification shield had been deployed to protect the deflection. When members emerged and began describing the briefing in terms they could legally use, the anger was not performative. It was the specific frustration of people who had accepted significant constraints on their ability to speak publicly, constraints that exist to protect genuine national security interests, and received in exchange a presentation that did not require those constraints to exist, and they had given up their ability to speak freely. Bondi's team had given up nothing. That exchange defines the current state of the Epstein oversight fight more clearly than any single hearing moment or document reveal. The public confrontations, Goldman's email, Roy's withholding criteria memo, Moskowitz's redacted name, had established a pattern of selective disclosure being challenged by documentation. The closed-door briefing was supposed to move beyond that pattern to provide the members of Congress responsible for oversight with the kind of substantive truth that cannot be delivered in a public setting without compromising legitimate security interests. Instead, it extended the pattern into a new setting. The questions that cannot be answered in public were not answered in private, and the members who attended now carry the knowledge that the administration has made a deliberate choice, not a procedural delay, not a bureaucratic backlog, not a legitimate classification dispute, but a deliberate choice to treat the oversight process as a communication strategy rather than a constitutional obligation. That conclusion is not one they reached emotionally or politically. They reached it by sitting in a room, asking specific questions, receiving non-answers, and recognizing the architecture of what had just been done to them. The briefing did not close the gap between what Congress has demanded and what the Department of Justice has provided. It widened it. Because now, the members who attended understand not just that the information is being withheld, but that the withholding is being actively managed at a level of sophistication that extends into the oversight process itself. The 3 million pages are still locked away. The executive equities consultations are still unexplained. The reputational protection criteria are still the operating standard behind closed doors, as well as in public. But something shifted in that corridor outside the briefing room. The members who walked out were no longer debating whether the Department of Justice was being fully transparent. They had walked into that room with that question still open. They walked out with it closed. The answer was no. And the answer was no in a setting specifically designed to be yes. What comes next is already in motion. Subpoena discussions that had been proceeding cautiously accelerated after the briefing, or members who had been willing to wait for additional voluntary releases began moving toward compulsory mechanisms. The patience that congressional oversight depends on, the assumption that good faith engagement will eventually produce genuine disclosure, eroded significantly in the hours after those closed-door doors opened and the members inside walked out with nothing they hadn't already known. The briefing was supposed to end the argument. What it ended instead was the argument about whether the administration was arguing in good faith. If you believe that a classified briefing should deliver classified truth, not a classified version of the same public deflection, share this breakdown. Leave a comment with your reaction to what happened in that corridor. Subscribe to the channel because the subpoena timeline is now moving faster than anyone expected, and the next confrontation will not be behind closed doors. The briefing failed. The oversight continues, and the 3 million pages are still waiting for someone with the authority to force them open.